So we are going to be talking today about trauma, about healing from trauma, and about narcissists and narcissistic abuse, all the cool, scary, exciting, fascinating words. But first of all, my guest, today I have Caroline Strawson. Welcome, Caroline.
Hi, it's really great to be here and to see everybody from all over the world, because it is a topic that holds no bounds.
Oh, yes, that's true. So welcome to Honest Conversations. And I want to read out your bio so that I don't mess it up. And by the way, congratulations on your new book. If you have it handy, you can just wave it maybe to us. It has such a fascinating title, isn't it? Because I didn't see it in your bio, that's why. We'll start with the book, The Unseen Wounds of Women. But here's the official bio. Caroline Strawson is a multi-award winning ICF accredited trauma-informed coach and therapist and founder of CPD Accredited School of Embodied Trauma-Informed Living. She uses a unique integration of brain-body-based therapies such as brain spotting, internal family systems, EMDR, hypnotherapy, breathwork, and positive psychology, and specializes in narcissistic and domestic abuse with the wounds that are unseen. Having been in a narcissistic marriage, accumulating in over, I believe it's 100,000 dead, and losing her family home, Caroline was diagnosed with complex PTSD, depression, anxiety, and self-harm. She hit rock bottom and is now driven to support, educate, and inspire others to overcome narcissistic abuse after completely turning her own life around. She's a #1 best-selling author of Divorce Became My Superpower, host of #1 iTunes podcast with over 1 million downloads, the Narcissistic Trauma Recovery podcast. She has appeared on national television, newspapers, magazines, and radio, and supports thousands with her deep nervous system healing programs to help them step into post-traumatic growth. So welcome once again. The official, stuffy, complicated part is over. By the way, you know, when I read, my strong non-native accent is the strongest.
It's really interesting as I'm listening to all that. It just always takes me back and think, oh my God, that is me now, you know, because I still have to pinch myself, because when I think where I was sort of 10 years ago, the person you see now was absolutely not the person that I was then. So yeah, I still have to pinch myself with that.
It's interesting to hear your bio read at you, although it's a different topic from what we announced. It really feels like looking at someone else, and yeah, I always find a little bit. I find it's like a little uncomfortable, maybe at times.
It is
in my own bio read back to me. Yes.
Yes.
But the topic of today's conversation is going to be actually how to heal. How to heal the aftermath of the trauma that you get from narcissistic abuse. I'm rephrasing, of course. And you know, before we started, Caroline mentioned that, you mentioned that you define narcissism a little bit differently. I would like you to maybe start with that because, well, like any academic conversation, we start with definitions. But also I want to give a little bit of a background story because I think it's a bit funny story. I remember me and my two friends were driving on a holiday, and I was actually driving, my two friends were in the car, and we were chatting about narcissists. And one of my friends has a very narcissistic dad, and we kept talking about that. And the third friend from the back seat tells us, oh my God, I've never had narcissists in my life. And both of us in the front seat, me driving and in the passenger seat, I didn't quite turn around, but we were like, what? Are you serious? She's like, yeah, I've been blessed. I've never had any narcissists in my life. And then we keep driving, and literally she starts sharing something about her mother-in-law. And 5 minutes later, me and my friend in the front seat, we're just laughing. We're like, so you said you never had narcissists in your life. Who do you think you're describing right now? So can we start with definition? And maybe it's a little unfair of me to ask you, but what is your estimation? How likely it is that we have someone narcissist in our vicinity, in like our close circle, maybe?
Yeah, very, very likely that would be the case. And I think what you highlight there is something really interesting around people who think they don't know any narcissists, or they know every narcissist in the world, because it's a word that we hear so much. And I think, you know, there's so many misunderstandings about what a narcissist is, narcissistic personality disorder, because actually narcissist is used in the DSM. So the DSM is what mental health professionals use to diagnose a narcissist with narcissistic personality disorder. Now, I don't necessarily agree with the diagnostic nature of this, and I'll explain why. Firstly, I look at things through a trauma-informed lens. So a lot of the stuff that's in the DSM are really labels for symptoms of trauma. And the problem being with narcissistic personality disorder, which is listed in the DSM, there are 9 traits listed. So somebody, and I'm sure many of you, if you have been in contact with a narcissist, which would probably be all of you, just think about the narcissist that you know. For them to actually go in and get a diagnosis, the narcissist would have to go, I think I have something wrong with me. I may be a narcissist. I'm going to go and see somebody. I'm going to have 5 or more of these 9 traits, and then I'm going to get a diagnosis. Now, the problem being is this does happen on rare occasions, but on the whole, to get a diagnosis means someone would have to recognize that there was something wrong and go and see somebody to get a diagnosis. And the problem being is there are only 9 traits listed in the DSM to get the diagnosis for narcissistic personality disorder. And one of those, just as an example, is a lack of empathy. And narcissists do have a lack of empathy. However, they can fake what we call cognitive empathy, which is using the front part of the brain. So they will fake empathy to get what we call their drug of choice, narcissistic supply. So I look at narcissism quite differently. So in the work that I do, I use an evidence-based parts therapy called internal family systems. And some of you may have heard of that. For me, this was transformational, not only in my own healing for myself, but also in how I work with my community and my clients. So IFS doesn't really look at a pathology as such of somebody. It looks at what we call protector parts. So with IFS, the premise is we are all born with a sense of self. We all have this essence of who we are, where we are curious and creative and confident. We live with compassion, and we have these traits of self, and we all have them. We are born like that. Now, normally what happens to us in childhood, for whatever reason, this could be from abuse, but equally it could be from our interpretation of our parents and caregivers, you know, an unemotional parent, for instance. What happens is we then create beliefs about ourselves. Maybe I'm not good enough, I'm not worthy, I'm unlovable, or I'm not important. That creates what we can commonly call an inner child wound. That becomes really, really painful. And we call this an exile in internal family systems. And that exile, if you think about us as human beings, we're driven for survival. You know, our nervous system is there to keep us safe and to move us away from pain. So the pain of a child feeling not good enough or unworthy is really painful. And that our inner system then kind of goes, oh, don't want to feel like this again. So we have these protector parts that then show up for us. And protector parts are going to be things like people pleasing, perfectionism. Equally, they can be things like addiction, self-harm, suicidal thoughts, dissociation. And these protector parts that will then show up for us to distract or move us away from feeling what our wound is that normally has formed in childhood. So kind of going back to then what I call a narcissist, and the same for us that end up in relationships for narcissists with narcissists too. I see the term narcissist as a umbrella word for an individual who has these abusive protector parts. For me, that kind of sits in the middle then of not the diagnostic pathologizing of somebody and the hard nature then of getting a diagnosis for somebody, but equally the compassionate side of us as human beings of recognizing narcissists aren't born that way. There's no scientific research to say they are born like that. They are created from childhood interpretation, very often a golden child, but equally there are 10 different types of narcissists that I teach as well. So they can then show up. So for me, the umbrella term from an individual who has had childhood trauma and they have these abusive protector parts like gaslighting, manipulation, control. Equally, it can be addiction to porn. It can be coercive control. It can be addictions. This umbrella then term of these individuals' protector parts, I call a narcissist. That then makes it so much easier for survivors to start to recognize. And the word narcissist to me isn't for the narcissist as such. It's for those survivors, those people who have been in these narcissistic relationships, for them to recognize that there is a term for these abusive protector parts, that they can then see it isn't their fault. And equally, the magnet normally to a narcissist is what we call a codependent, somebody who has a lack of self-love. And again, that is someone who's born as themselves. They then have a painful wound, like I'm not good enough, and they then get protector parts showing up for themselves, like people pleasing. You know, codependents are often people pleasers, perfectionists, high achievers. And the reason I say that was me, that was my protector parts growing up, high achieving, people pleasing, perfectionist. So the collective term then for these types of protector parts, I like to call codependent. The problem being with a narcissist is, again, we have no scientific research and evidence to say we can cure and actually help a narcissist get better. There is medication that can help and will allow them to kind of be less abusive, but not to the extent where they can have a healthy relationship either. There isn't any scientific research for that. And remember, we can't help somebody who doesn't recognize the problem that they are causing to someone else. If I said to my ex-husband, for instance, hey, listen, I know there's some childhood trauma there. I know these are your protector parts. Let's work with those and let's work on that childhood wound. Of course, his answer would be, no, I'm behaving like this because you are behaving like that. This is nothing to do with me. So they are always projecting their pain outwardly onto others. The problem being is how we then receive that projection of that pain.
So I do want to confirm, not confirm, but I mean, I want to dig deeper a little bit. I'm really glad that you mentioned that we sometimes are a little bit easy to slap the term on people. And I do agree that there's a lot of throwing of the word around. Yet, with that said, a lot of the times we call people narcissists when they show their, traditionally what is called grandiose narcissism. And any other subtype of narcissism, which may be still very hard and abusive, we very often don't recognize, especially if they have this, I don't recall how you call this empathy, but the one which is like a short empathy, right? Yeah. So how do you recognize, why I'm asking that is because sometimes it's really hard to realize that you are in that relationship, especially if you can't put a finger on that. Just an example from my personal life, there was a person in my life who was very lovable and sweet and had the, she was known almost like an angelic person, yet I always felt that she said something so painful to me. And for a while I thought maybe she's just naive and she is just not thinking straight and she's saying things without realizing that she's hurting me. And it just kept going. I started avoiding the person actually, until I realized that she was having like very direct, passive aggressive kind of stabs, where something is happening, you feel, but you can't put a finger on that. Until one day I just got myself together and I said, do you have a problem with me? Did I hurt you somehow? Let's talk about it. Like, tell me, I'd like to be better. And she said, no, I love you. Later, when I was reading some literature on narcissism, I started recognizing, but it was impossible to put the finger on the fact that a person who's so likable could actually be a narcissist.
Correct. And what you're talking about is what we call a covert narcissist.
Covert.
So a lot of what we think about when we think of narcissist is just as you say, someone who walks into a room, commands attention, very grandiose, could be very malignant, narcissist too. The covert narcissist, like the one you've described, is somebody who what we call is like a wolf in sheep's clothing. They often act like the victim themselves. So they will go out and it will be things like, oh, I can't do that. And manipulation, gaslighting, just as you said, you started to feel in your body, this is the trauma stuff, our nervous system is going like radar, something is off here. You're feeling this, and we call this neuroception. Your body was feeling something wasn't right, yet she's your friend. She's meant to be really nice to you. So cognitively, you're kind of thinking one thing. They're saying nice things. Of course, everything is fine. Your body is going alert, 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 because there's something wrong. And what we're talking about here is the people who end up in narcissistic relationships and stay in narcissistic relationships are the ones with protector parts like people pleasing, maybe those who lack more boundaries, you know, we're always trying to get and seek external validation for somebody else. So if you are in a relationship with a covert narcissist, whether that be a friend, a parent, or a partner, their behavior is we're always trying to fix it because we need them to give us our external approval so that we can then calm in our system and feel good enough. And the covert narcissist is probably the most hardest to spot because they portray themselves as being very kind. They portray themselves as being a certain way publicly, but they are just, like you say, there's some passive aggressiveness around it. There is an element of the poor me in this too, but they are doing it in a way to make you feel like something inside. And this forms part of what I call the narcissistic abuse cycle. So they will be really, really nice to you, and they will really say all the things that you want to hear and feel because they're almost filling that hole in your soul of not feeling good enough. So you're trying to please them. They're saying all the right things, but then there comes a stage, just as you said, you started to question that. You know, you asked the question, you look, is everything okay? You know, is everything all right? Have I done something wrong? And of course they're like, no, it's fine. Or they then might start to say, why are you saying that? I just do all of this for you, X, Y, Z. And they kind of discard you. And when they discard you, you are left reeling because it's like reinforcing what you're feeling about yourself. Oh, I really mustn't be good enough. So you start trying to fix it again. And then what happens in that scenario is either the friendship relationship ends or you get hooked back into the cycle again. And in this narcissistic abuse cycle, this is when we become addicted to that feeling and what we call trauma bonding then as well. And we end up seeking out these types of relationships all the time because it's taking us back actually to our childhood often, where that version of relationship is actually normal to us to feel not good enough in these relationships as well. So the covert narcissist is the most difficult to spot. It's also probably when you break up from a covert narcissist in a relationship, one of the hardest ones to deal with, because when you break up from a relationship with a covert narcissist, it's not like maybe the malignant or the overt where everybody kind of knows that they are an overt narcissist, you know, because of their protector parts showing up, and we can see that. What happens with a covert narcissist is it almost looks like there are two survivors of potentially an abusive relationship. And I found this really difficult when I split up from my ex-husband, because he was portraying himself as a victim. The poor him. I did everything. I tried everything to fix it, you know, telling other people his version of events. And I remember I used to want to go around behind him with a great big megaphone and say, can I just tell you the truth now about all of this too? Because the thing was, they are so manipulative where they get people to believe them. They get people to go, no, it wasn't your fault. No, you know, because they are so convincing. And that leaves you feeling even more like you're not good enough, because sometimes your friends or even your family might start to believe the covert narcissist above what you are saying. And it can make it really, really difficult then from a healing perspective. And that's why it's really important to surround yourself with communities and others who really understand this with no judgment and are just there for you as you're going through this process of healing.
What defines, or how do you know that you are, or how can you even start understanding that you might be in a narcissistic relationship? Because as you said, some of them are really hard to spot, and then even harder to prove.
Absolutely. And I think this is where we see so much of this online. And whilst I give the term narcissist, obviously, to that individual with those abusive protector parts, and I talk a lot about narcissistic abuse, but I talk a lot more about narcissistic trauma. The reason why I talk about narcissistic trauma more than narcissistic abuse is what the narcissist does. We cannot change that at any stage. If you've been in a relationship with a narcissist, you've had abuse, there's nothing we can do about that. Sadly, it has happened. What you have, though, as the individual is trauma. So trauma isn't necessarily the narcissist. Trauma is about our nervous system's inability to cope in that scenario and how we then see ourselves because of the narcissist. So when I was with my ex-husband, who was a covert narcissist, it wasn't necessarily him making me feel a certain way. It was his behavior and me saying to myself on a deep nervous system level, he's behaving like that because I'm not good enough. That was my trauma of the narcissistic abuse. That part I can change. So we can never change a narcissist behavior, but what we can change is how we receive the narcissist behavior and how we shift at our deep nervous system level, then how we are receiving that. You know, my ex-husband hasn't changed in all of the years, and we've been apart 11, 12 years now, and we were together 14 years. He's exactly the same over those 20 plus years. But I have now changed how I feel about myself. I now know and feel good enough. So whatever he says, I now know it's not because of me. It's never been a reflection of me. But when I was stuck in the trauma part of it, I saw his behavior as a reflection of me. So when we talk about how do we notice all of this, it really is about us starting to recognize, how are we feeling in our body in that relationship? Are we able to voice how we feel? Or do we feel that we are losing our sense of self? Do we feel like we are showing more up as a protector part? When I was in my relationship with my ex-husband, I had a very strong emotional eating protector part. I don't know whether anyone else can relate to that. I had So when he would be gaslighting and saying these things, my body would be on alert, just as you were saying with your friend there, Christina. My body was on alert for that. However, I knew that if I said something to my ex-husband, that would actually cause me more pain. So my emotional eating protector part showed up, and it was almost like, hey, Caroline, go and eat something that will numb you out, that will diminish the pain you are feeling and distract you away from feeling what my core inner child wound was of feeling not good enough. Because the narcissist it was like he was continually picking the scab off my inner child wound of not being good enough. So to me, staying in the relationship was better than leaving. Breadcrumbs of love with a narcissist to my inner system, because I had a deep wound of not feeling good enough, being in any relationship and having breadcrumbs was still safer and less painful to me than having no relationship at all. However, my system was still driven to know that it wasn't right, it wasn't safe. So it would distract me with emotional eating. And then when we split up, I then had a dissociative protector part, a self-harming protector part. You know, I used to use the end of the toothpaste and literally score the tops of my thighs. And that might seem like, and I knew cognitively that was not good. I shouldn't be doing that. But my nervous system was driven to try and protect me from feeling not good enough. And it's almost like my system was like, okay, what feels more painful to my system? Feeling like a not good enough 7-year-old little girl because my ex-husband was still abusing me as we had split up, or the pain of scoring the tops of my thighs. So actually the pain doing this on the tops of my thighs was less painful than feeling the pain of a little girl feeling not good enough. This is why we can never judge anybody when they're showing up blended with a protector part. I knew cognitively, shouldn't be doing this. I shouldn't do that. Just like people who maybe have addictions or eating disorders. Yeah. You know, we kind of cognitively know, don't do it. But the moment that inner child wound is triggered, our inner system, it takes over, and we will blend with a part of us to distract and minimize us away from all of that too. But the problem being then is we judge ourselves even more. We isolate ourselves even more as well. And I know that when we talk about the healing element of this, for me, I needed to be aware of that. And then I needed to bring intention to my healing. I had zero boundaries. You know, everything for me was about making sure the world was happy, everybody else. You know, if my ex-husband wasn't happy, or indeed anybody else, well, it was my fault. I needed to please everybody because my sense of worth came from how other people acted and behaved. Now, the narcissist at the start is very good at making you actually feel good enough and worthy, filling all of those wounds that you have. The problem being at some stage, it never becomes good enough. And they will then change their behavior. It will become more abusive, the gaslighting, the coercive control, you know, porn, addictions, anger, they will show up. And that then triggers our inner child wounds. So we will continually then try to make it better, but we're always fighting a losing battle because it never will be better. There's never a goal. There's never a destination that you can meet with a narcissist because nothing will ever be good enough. And that's when they keep you in that looping cycle and we start to become addicted because we have that oxytocin and dopamine rush of when they're love bombing you and making you feel good. And then when they kick in their abusive behavior and are producing more cortisol in our body as we go into a fight, flight, or freeze response. We literally get physiologically addicted to our hormone secretion of being in that abusive cycle. That's why we can never judge anybody who stays in a narcissistic relationship. You know, we can't judge them. To them, it's safer to stay than to actually leave.
Well, and I guess sometimes we do genuinely love the people who are narcissists, because that can be a parent, that can be a child as well. And like, you know, this is something you are not going to cut out of your life, probably. Since I started being interested in psychology, I realized that some traits, even narcissistic traits, or some manipulation, is just part of our culture. We do that naturally occasionally. Sometimes we just learn it from our parents. So how do you know that if you are behaving in that, maybe not specifically a narcissist, but maybe in a way like a narcissist would?
I love that question, because I think it is so important to differentiate. What's the difference between a narcissist and narcissistic traits, for instance? We all have narcissistic traits, all of us, you know, and it's okay to have some of these sometimes. The difference then between a narcissist and, say, someone like you and I, who may exhibit sometimes narcissistic traits, is we can acknowledge that if we behaved or showed up as the protector part, and somebody was being hurt by our behavior, for instance, we would acknowledge that. We might even be hurt that we were hurting somebody else. We would talk to that person. We would want to make it better, to make it right. We would take some ownership and responsibility of all of that, because we would be able to understand that our behavior was impacting somebody else. We would understand that subjective distress that our behavior was then having on somebody else, and we would look to change that. We would look to understand that. The problem being with a narcissist is they won't do that. There is no ownership or responsibility of that subjective distress that their behavior or protector parts then projects onto somebody else. They don't have that. So the difference then between narcissistic traits is we'll take ownership of that. If we're hurting somebody else, we will understand, we will try and do something about it. The narcissist won't. The narcissist will just say, no, I am behaving like this because of you. You know, I'm responding to your behavior. They won't ever acknowledge that actually what they are doing is abuse, because that is actually too painful to their own inner child wounds, because all narcissists are actually the most deeply insecure people, but they show up so blended with their protector parts and project that outwardly. You never get to see, obviously, what their inner child wounds are, to then go back to them behaving as their sense of self. And it's incredibly sad. I'd love to be able to say, you know, let me help as such, but they won't acknowledge that, and they don't take any ownership or responsibility. Whereas people like you and I and everybody else here, we would.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. We have Amaresh here. So if you're ready, you can switch on your camera, hopefully too, and voice for sure. Hey.
Hi.
Yes.
Am I audible enough? Right. So my question is, I have been kind of living with a parent who is covertly narcissistic, and this is something which was very new for me. So thank you for highlighting that aspect. And despite me being in the field of mental health, I have been helping people, but now over the conversation, I am sort of realizing that I have developed quite a lot of narcissistic traits myself. And kind of during this conversation itself, the fear of tipping the point of becoming narcissistic rather than having narcissistic traits is kind of rising up. But more than that, I just want to understand, especially when a parent is narcissistic, especially an overt narcissist, what would be your take of how to deal with a parent and have healthy relationship?
Yeah. And again, a great question, because like you say, you know, if we have a partner, sometimes, you know, we can go no contact or extreme modified contact. That can be quite difficult when they're a parent, right? They're part of your family dynamic, particularly if they're an overt narcissist as well. This is where boundaries are going to be really, really important. You know, my dad isn't necessarily, I would say, a narcissist, but he is highly narcissistic with his traits, okay, with his protector parts. So I have a very boundaried relationship with my father. And what I would say to you, and indeed to any of you who have parents who are narcissists, is it's not necessarily about your parent here. It's you being able to look in the mirror and know what a great son you are being to the best of your ability, knowing that your parent is a narcissist. This is about how you feel inside. Am I still able to be the best son I can possibly be to my father, knowing he is a narcissist within these boundaries that I am creating? So that is looking at, you know, maybe if he gives you a call, for instance, don't answer, let it go to voicemail, and then call him back maybe when you've only got 5 minutes to spare. Hey dad, I noticed you gave me a call, I've got 5 minutes, is everything okay? So you're kind of creating a very boundaried relationship, so to speak, so that you can still look in the mirror and know that you've still got your father, you've still got a semblance of relationship. I think it's also acceptance. It's never potentially going to be the ideal relationship we would all love to have with our parents at the end of the day. And that is learning to reparent yourself with that. So reparenting yourself and giving yourself all the things, sadly, that maybe one of your parents were incapable. Your father's not behaving like this because of you, okay? Your father's behaving like this because he's incapable of actually behaving anything else. And just to highlight the point you said about, am I, and I see this a lot, the worry is, am I now dipping into being a narcissist, so to speak, okay? We have something in our brain called mirror neurons. And when we're in these narcissistic relationships, indeed, whether it be parents or in our partnerships, okay? Remember, our biological survival instinct is to stay safe and in the least amount of pain. So what can happen is with these mirror neurons that we have in our brain, we start to mirror sometimes the narcissist behavior. Okay. And we do that not because we are a narcissist. We do that because our inner system goes, if I behave like this and I'm mirroring their behavior, maybe the volume will go down on how much they are abusing me with their behavior. So it is not that you are a narcissist. I know just by hearing and talking to you, you are not a narcissist, okay? Because you're recognizing and you're bringing awareness to all of this. So let me reassure you on that. What you're highlighting is the potential of mirror neurons. And I'd really invite you to look at your relationship with your father, create some really strong boundaries, know that you are an amazing son, even if you have a boundaried relationship with your father, and then look at how you can reparent yourself and give you all of those wonderful things that you deserve to have, that sadly your father maybe was incapable of giving you as well.
Can I add another layer to it, if I may?
Yes, you can add the after question. It's fine.
So the situation is, I am living with my parents.
Okay.
It's not that we are living apart. It's being an Indian, it's kind of part of our culture that we stay with our parents. Yeah. And hence, I wanted to know from you if there would be any change in case of boundaries. Because if I was living separately, it's easier to maintain boundaries. Correct. At the same house, what would be your take on?
So I would invite you to think about creating a safe space in your house. What we're talking about here is your healing. I know I could live with my ex-husband now and feel no activation in my body around that. The reason being is because I know and I feel I am good enough. This is what we talk about, the trauma work then, that nervous system healing, okay? When we feel activated, remember, it's not your father making you feel the way you do in your body. It's what you are saying to yourself on a deep level about why your father is behaving like that. He's being like this because I'm not a good enough son, or I'm not worthy enough or lovable enough. This comes from those inner child wounds. So what I would say is keep continuing to work on those inner child wounds that are making you feel activated when you are around your father. The other thing I would say, and this is really good for all of our nervous systems, is maybe to create a space in your home that you can go and down-regulate your nervous system so that in these moments you are having maybe the activation being in fight, flight, freeze or fawn with your father, but also having a space where you can come back to this present moment again, just really calming your nervous system, going back into what we call our ventral vagal part of our nervous system, where we can feel present. We feel as an adult, we're in the front part of our brain again. It doesn't mean it's a nice situation. It just means that you are coming from a place of understanding and compassion in yourself, as opposed to you then blending with a protector part, seeing how your father is too. Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Amarash, for joining us and for asking your questions. I really appreciate when people come and ask real questions from real life, because it makes it so much more relatable. And I will ask Bianca to bring in more people as we talk. just continuously as much time as we have, because I know there are so many questions and I want to give as many chances to people as possible. And while we are waiting for someone to join us, because it might take a few minutes, I'll ask you a very quick question. So if people are interested in this topic and they're just uncovering that, you know, there is something to work on, do you actually work with people one-on-one if they would be interested? Yeah.
So I work with people one-on-one. I also have a deep healing, and it's a cognitive and a somatic healing program called the Narcissistic Trauma Recovery Program, because talking about narcissistic abuse and time sadly doesn't heal the trauma within us. We have to do the body work. So I use things like somatic experiencing, IFS, brain spotting, EMDR, and positive psychology, because it's all very well, you know, one of my biggest goals is not to help people just survive, you know, work on that trauma, heal yourself and get back to living again. I want people to actually thrive and flourish. This is why I bring positive psychology into the work that I do, because we have a term in positive psychology called post-traumatic growth. And post-traumatic growth is actually living an even better life, an even more deeper, connected, joyful life, because of the trauma that you have been through. I now know, when I think prior to my relationship with my ex-husband, you know, I lived an okay life and I was still a people pleaser and everything else, but it would have been okay. I now know I lead a much more joyful, more deeply connected, purposeful life because of literally the dark days that I have had. You know, if someone had said that to me in the dark days, I'd have probably slapped them and said, no, I'm never going to have post-traumatic growth, because it felt like a long, dark tunnel. But I actually know that having gone through all of that, it was like an awakening for me of what is important in my life. And, you know, for me, that post-traumatic growth piece in the work that I do is so important. I don't want people to just survive. I want them to thrive and flourish and continually keep working on their healing forevermore, because healing is not a destination. You know, the narcissist is just uncovering layers of our own inner child wounds. And as we live our life, we're always starting to recognize. So it's about recognizing if my nervous system is activated, getting curious about that, and keeping on working through those layers all of the time, because as we get to a new level, there's always a new devil all of the time too. And the narcissist is just really good at shining a great big spotlight on those for us.
Yes, thank you. We have a Dia. I do not know if I'm pronouncing right, but you can. Yes, you've joined us. Great. I'll switch on my microphone. Switch off, I mean.
Hello.
Hi there. Nice to see you.
It's Dia. Yeah, thank you. Actually, I've been divorced like for 12 years. My son now is 19 years old. And when we got divorced, he was, you know, a kid. And well, he has some issues with his autistic spectrum, and you know, I wasn't enough for his father, and therefore even with this autistic spectrum issues and other things that our son has, challenges, he just behaves to our son like he behaved to me, like you know, I'm gonna show my love for you if you do things good, right? So I just, you know, I got divorced because I, you know, I was psychiatristically ill. And also my kid went on a medication as well. And like 2 years ago, my son was really getting worse, and he was, I got him crying, and he said, do you think that Dad would understand if I jump out of the window? Would he know that he's really something doing wrong? And that was the last moment. I said, I don't know what to do. I just would love to explain to him that it is not his fault. My husband's mother was very cold person, and he probably caught it as you were talking about the umbrella, and he's trying to be distant so he cannot get hurt. And I understand that. That doesn't mean I want to live with him, but what to do to make him stop hurting my son, because it really hurts not only him but me.
I hear you. And firstly, as a fellow mum in this situation, I'm sure many can relate to this as well. You know, my heart goes out to you, because not only will there probably be a lot of guilt and shame you are feeling about your son going through all of this as well. And I hear you. And I want to speak to that part of you as well in a moment. What we have to realize is, and you kind of said it at the end, how can I get him to stop? The hard thing is, and we can never get them to stop. They will not stop, because they are driven by needing something to soothe their own wounds. What we have in situations when we're dealing with another parent who is a narcissist is children exhibiting trauma responses. So you often find a child will be in what we call a freeze trauma response when they're with the narcissistic parent, or a fawn response. So they look like they are being very compliant. They look like everything is okay. They are pleasing the abuser, but that is in the hope, obviously, that the abuse will lessen. Externally, though, that can sometimes look like, well, hey, they're all right with them. They're all right with the narcissist, because actually they look like they're okay. But if you are taught, and this is why the work I do is trauma informed, we look at it through a lens. When I see children like this, I can see they're in a freeze response. The issue being is because our nervous system works on a hierarchy, it goes from freeze to fight, flight, and then back to that safety and connection. When they come back to you, where they do actually feel safer, they produce more cortisol in the body, they mobilize more energy, because they shift from freeze actually into fight flight. However, a fight flight response from a human perspective, when we see it, actually looks more destructive, because they can be more energy, more anxious, more angry, more aggressive even. But it's actually because they feel safer with you. But externally, it can look like they look worse when they're with the non-narcissistic parent than when they're with the narcissistic one. So that's the first thing that I want to say around that, because it can look very, very different. And this is why I think the court systems, everything, they're not trauma informed. The whole system is broken around this, because they're not looking at it through a trauma lens. They're not looking at it from a nervous system perspective here either. When you talk about your son showing up, most people, I've never met anybody who isn't. And, you know, complex PTSD isn't in the DSM actually. Okay, now complex PTSD is complex post-traumatic stress disorder, and this is really PTSD, but it's where it's over a long period of time, and it's not listed in the DSM. However, every single person I have met who has been involved with a narcissist on a long-term basis exhibits all the signs and symptoms of complex PTSD. Now, with your son, if you're factoring in ASD, so he's on the autistic spectrum, and complex PTSD in this scenario, okay, he's going to have an extremely dysregulated nervous system, okay? Now, the hard part, okay? You cannot change your ex, okay? The only thing that you can do is create the best relationship you can with your son, and even with boundaries sometimes with your son, with maybe his potentially aggressive behavior and that with you. And it's going back to what we were saying before. You need to be able to look yourself in the mirror and know, and I hope you hear these words, you are an amazing mom, even if your son acts in a dysregulated way. This is not your fault. Okay, it isn't your fault. And this is one of the hardest things I think as parents we have in this situation, that we feel like because your son is behaving like that, that in some way this is your fault. It isn't. You have always done the best that you can, given your own trauma from your own past experiences as well. The thing I would focus on again is inner work for yourself, so that you can find a sense of acceptance and peace, that you know you are doing the best job that you can possibly be as a mum, because you are, okay, to try and lift, because you're blending with guilty parts, you're blending with inner critical parts of yourself in some way. You cannot change your ex. We have to put our blinkers on there. We have to look at what we can control, not what we can't. You trying to control a narcissist is like you drinking rat poison and expecting the rat to die. Sadly, it's not going to happen. It's just poisoning you inside. And this is then where you remain in your trauma responses. And this is then when, and again, I'd love to know how many of you are on this. This then leads to disease and illness. You know, I see so many in my community sadly suffering with autoimmune disorders like fibromyalgia, IBS, alopecia, digestive issues, skin problems, and more serious natures around all of this too, okay? It is not your fault. This is now your opportunity to bring awareness to how you feel. The biggest gift you can give to your son is to work on yourself. When you heal yourself, you work towards healing the next generation, okay? But it isn't your fault. You are an amazing mom, even if your son feels and acts the way that he does, okay?
Thank you so much.
Welcome.
Thank you, dear, for joining and for asking such a good question. I'm also a mother, so it's such a good question. I couldn't even think of how, when we are witnessing someone suffering from a narcissist, that's probably the hardest. We do have time for at least one more person, so Bianca, please do come to bring someone on to join us. And if we go to the very edge of the time, I want to ask you already now to start leaving your hearts for my wonderful guest. Because we're coming to the very end of this interview. Bianca, do we have someone joining us?
Yes, we do.
Yay, good.
5 seconds. We have Bonita with us.
And here is Bonita. Bonita, you can join us now to ask your question.
Good morning. Thank you so much for this topic. One of the things I found with dealing with my own trauma is that I know it goes to inner child wounds, really about not even being enough about survival, but like, oh my God, if I don't do this, I may not survive.
Right.
And I've done a lot of work on it, but I still, wherever I go, there I am. I keep finding myself kind of starting in a relationship that doesn't seem to be like past ones, and then we end up back there. And I was hoping you could talk about ways to heal that so that we don't keep repeating those things.
Yeah, and again, it's a multi-layered approach on this. And I think what you're highlighting there is the body work. We have to work in the body when we look to heal any type of trauma, whether it be narcissistic trauma or indeed childhood, every type of trauma. We have to work in the body. We know it's obviously to do with our childhood, and we can't change our childhood. You know, once we are adults, we cannot change that. But what we absolutely can change is our experience of our childhood. As we're going through this, just as you say, if we look at this from a nervous system perspective, it can be survival for many of us in our childhood, you know, and our nervous system literally goes into going between fight, flight, freeze, and our nervous system doesn't actually know what it's like to feel safe. You know, when we are born and we come into this world, we already have a really robust fight, flight, and freeze response in our sympathetic and what we call our dorsal vagal part of our nervous system. That social engagement part, that safety element, has to be taught by our parents and caregivers. Now, if it isn't taught and we don't know what healthy love is, we don't know what healthy attachment is, you know, we end up being avoidant or anxious or disorganized. We don't know what that secure attachment is like for us to feel safe in this world. We are constantly almost seeking out relationships to try and heal the wounds that weren't completed for us in our childhood. This is where you need to work with someone who knows what they're doing around all of this as well, so that they can help you understand. So when I work with my clients, we do a whole parts mapping. So we look at all of your protector parts that are showing up. We look at what that inner child wound is, and then we really look at changing the experience of that inner child. And it might be certain events, it might be certain experiences, so that you then know, okay, I went through all of this, but I now know and feel it wasn't my fault. Because so many of us, when we look back on our childhood, we know things weren't our fault. We know we were good enough. You know, what child isn't good enough in their childhood? We know it was somebody's fault, or it was a parent or somebody else. We know that. The problem being, our body is still telling a different story. It's literally wired in, literally into our fascia. You know, again, how many are listening right now? Your shoulders are up, your jaw is clenched, and it becomes our normal way of life. That's how we end up living our life. But this is the trauma that's trapped in our body. So we have to work somatically around all of this too. There's an element of validation, of understanding and recognizing it's not your fault, but we have to really work at a deep nervous system level here and really complete those response cycles, have those corrective attachment experiences of that which we never had. And that is you giving that to yourself, that which you didn't have as a child, and also doing it either in a community like this, or say, this is what we do in the programs that I have, because that in itself is really, really healing too, because we often feel very isolated, and people equals danger to us very often. And we're always kind of on hyper alert with all of that too. So really it's doing that body work. Talking therapy is great in validating experiences. You know, it's almost like you imagine if you say suffer from depression, you go to the doctors and they might give you medication. And I'm an advocate of medication as well. I have a medical background. So, you know, medication can be good. However, what is the root cause of why someone has depression? You know, I work on root cause resolution. I can help people manage in the present why their nervous system is activated. We can do VU breathing, we can do bilateral stimulation, we can do lots of things of managing the symptoms of the trauma. But ultimately, we want to get to that root cause. The root cause resolution, that's often in our childhood. We need to go back there and work with that, but in what we call a very titrated way. We live in a society where we want to rush everything. We want to be healed yesterday. We don't want to feel like this anymore, right? But very often what happens is people go too fast, too quick, and our nervous system becomes flooded. So it might seem good in a session with somebody and it feels great because you've got that validation, but actually it's too much, too quick for our nervous system and within our brain. So we become completely flooded and we go into shutdown again. So actually sometimes slowing down in our healing process actually long-term speeds it up for us as well. And this is why you need people who know and understand the nuances of our nervous system, how our brain works, the neuroscience. That's why I talk a lot about trauma in the work that I do, the nervous system, how our brain is, the protector parts, because it all pieces together. Because I'm a big believer is we need to understand why we feel the way we do with the psych education, but then we need to get to the root cause of that and work somatically like that as well. But it can be healed. You know, things like complex PTSD, these are really just information processing disorders. They're stuck in our body. Our hippocampus, which is our long-term memory center, hasn't time-stamped things into the past. So we work somatically to timestamp it into the past. So we're not reliving constantly, we're remembering. And that completely shifts how we feel within our body.
That's great. Thank you. Yeah, very helpful. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. And good luck. You can heal trauma.
Okay, good. Thank you.
Thank you, Bonita, for joining us. We are coming to the end of our interview, unfortunately. Bianca, do you think we have time for one more question? I think I would love to give, I really enjoy when people get to ask their own questions.
Yeah, it's really great, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
that's right.
Cool, because I think it gives a different perspective and different way to understand the issue. I was even, as you were talking, I was even thinking maybe we could come up with a new format of actually people coming with their own cases and working on some cases like this, because I think it's so much more relatable when you hear someone else sharing their story and you suddenly see connections. We have, I think most of us have very similar life stories.
We do. I often get messages, is your ex the same as mine? Is your dad the same as mine? It's like we're all in this family together.
All right, so Maria is not ready to be on camera, but we can definitely read the question if you don't mind. So she's asking, how could we raise our children to avoid their developed narcissist personality?
Yeah, great question. Something I'm really passionate about. So again, heal yourself first and you will heal the next generation. What we have to do is recognize that we are good enough for who we are. This is why I love using internal family systems in the work that I do, so that you can live your life in what I call self-leadership. So I live my life as in self-leadership with compassion, with curiosity. That doesn't mean I don't have boundaries. That doesn't mean I don't feel stuff in my nervous system. I can feel protector parts coming up sometimes if someone says something mean or horrible. I can feel my emotional eating part wanting to come in, but I'm calming it in the system because I know it's actually there to protect me and to move me away from pain. But I'm kind of like, hey, you know what? I'm okay with all of this too. But from a child's perspective, the more you can work on yourself to create an environment based purely on love and security, it doesn't become conditional. And just to give you an example here, let's say you have a child at school and they've done really, really well. They've got 10 out of 10 on a spelling test, for instance, okay? Many parents, when the child comes back, would say, wow, well done. You've got 10 out of 10 on your spelling test. That's amazing. Now, on the surface, that might look okay. However, what we're doing, even by saying this is about self-parenting now, parenting from yourself, you're saying to that child, I'm getting praise because I got 10 out of 10. I now need to keep on getting 10 out of 10 to get praise. So tweak it. So if your child comes back and they've got 10 out of 10 on a spelling test, you say, wow, I am so proud of you for getting 10 out of 10. But because of how hard I know you have worked, it doesn't become about the grade. It doesn't become about the 10 out of 10. It becomes about the child and their effort. It becomes that you are telling them just for being them, doing their best is good enough. You know, it's not about a condition. It's not about how you look. It's not about how you do well at school or the sports teams that you are on. Simply for being you, you are good enough. I'll often say to my children, I'm so proud of you. And my son in particular will go, why? Because he hasn't done anything. And I often say, just for being you, just for breathing. I love you just for being you. And just to give you all some hope about this, I have an 18-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter, okay? When me and my ex-husband split up, my son was just 6 years old and my daughter was 3. And my son, I remember literally as clear as day, he dropped to the floor. No, my ex-husband took 5 minutes to leave. We lost our home. We were made homeless. I was in all of this debt. My son is now at university. I dropped him off on Friday at university. He was head boy of his school. My daughter is following suit as well. They are the most kind, compassionate, self-confident human beings you would ever meet. But they know that other people's behavior is never a reflection of them. Doesn't mean they don't get hurt and we don't have conversation, but they know it's not a reflection of them. And my son is messaging me at university going, oh, this is great. He's having an absolute ball. They have a semblance of a relationship with their father, not much. They love their dad because he's their dad, but they also know their father's behavior is zero reflection of them. They know just for being them, they are good enough. That is the power of healing yourself. That is the power of then passing that gift on to them. They will never end up in a narcissistic relationship. They have boundaries, but they're still kind and compassionate human beings. So I wanted to say that because if you'd have told me that when we split up and knowing how my children were anxious, all of these things, and I made a ton of mistakes as a parent at that stage as well, believe me, to know where they are now, it can be done. There is a light at the end of all of this, I promise you. There really is.
Thank you so much. Unfortunately, we have to finish right now, so we won't be able to say long goodbyes, but I'm glad you answered one of my follow-up questions to the question that Bianca read out. Is one healed parent enough? Obviously, one healed parent, this is enough. So thank you, Caroline, for sharing. It was a super exciting session. Unfortunately, guys, we have to finish right now. So leave your hearts. If you don't have a chance to leave in the chat, leave it in the video below, and I'll see you in a week. Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.